welcome to today's IANA webinar, Intermodal Analyzed with Larry Gross. I'm Hal Pollard. I'm the Director of Education and Committees at IANA, and I'm really pleased to have you here. So with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Mr. Larry Gross. He is the president and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting and known far and wide as the Intermodalist. For those of you who are not familiar with Larry, it will become obvious. He lives, breathes, sleeps, and sometimes does other things with Intermodal. And we are really pleased to have him here today. So with that, Larry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Hal, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you here after a pause of a couple of months in these webinars. Hal said that you should sit back and enjoy the slides. Well, I'm not sure that what I'm going to be showing you is necessarily characterized correctly as enjoyable. But what we are going to try and do here is to give you a quick snapshot of these very, very unusual times that we're experiencing right now here in the sector. What a crazy ride it has been and continues to be. Just for those of you who I've not had the pleasure of meeting, this is my little company, Gross Transportation Consulting. We do analysis on the intermodal market. We produce a monthly intermodal in-depth analytical report. That's a subscription product. We'd love to have you all subscribe. In addition, if you do that, you get the weekly flash updates. And you can find more information on that at the website, www.intermodalinDepth.com. So I wanted just to start off with a little bit of a refresher here. Old news for many of you, perhaps not for some. And that is just that whenever we talk about intermodal, we're really talking about two separate markets. And here you see that portrayed. And the way that we're differentiating these two markets is by equipment type. So a domestic piece of equipment is either going to be a 53-foot domestic container. There's a handful of 48s out there still, mostly in solid waste service. You still have TUFCs running. And that also includes, of course, international cargo that's being transloaded into 53-foot containers. On the international side, we have the ISO container sizes, 96 inches wide, and either 20-foot, 40-foot, or 45-foot in length. The vast majority being 40-footers, followed by 20s, and just a relatively small number of 45s. These two sectors are responding and driven by very, very different market forces. And domestic, very dramatically affected by the relative economics of versus truck and what's happening with truck capacity, fuel prices, as well as transloading, whereas the ISO side, IPI side, to use another term, inland point intermodal, is affected by international concerns such as what's happening in the steamship lines. So with that intro, let's take a look at what's been happening here. And as always, we're devoting basing a lot of our analysis on the IANA ETSO database, ETSO standing for Equipment Type, Size, and Ownership, which gives us monthly statistics on a region-to-region basis and allows us to drill down in a pretty fine manner as to what's happening. And what we're doing here is we're breaking out the total into its international and domestic components. And these are portrayed on these two charts, which on the left-hand side, we can see the monthly volume in terms of thousands, both for the total, which is the red line, and that reads off of the left-hand axis. And then the blue line is international, the green line is domestic, and those are reading off the right-hand axis. And the major salient point here that I want you to take away from this left-hand chart is the fact that since April, volume has been basically declining in the face of what we all know to be a very, very strong demand situation. So what this is saying is that the system is being operationally constrained because the demand is certainly there to have higher volume even than where we were probably back in March, which is the recent peak for total domestic, if you look at that red line. But we don't seem to be able to manage that. And instead, we're seeing a steady decline, which is an indication that the system is, I'll say, bogging down, becoming ever more congested in the face of this unrelenting demand. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The right-hand chart is presenting the same data, but all we're doing there is looking at the year-over-year change And if you look at the July numbers, the green bar is pointing downwards, which is an indication that total domestic activity actually has now fallen behind prior year for the first time during the pandemic recovery. We are still in the black with the international side. You can see that on the blue bar. That will probably only last for, it probably will disappear, I think, next month, and will actually be going into the negative. Another way to look at it that I think is somewhat more useful when you're in an operationally constrained situation is revenue moves per working day. And this is a fairly intricate calculation that we do that tries to take into account holidays, days of week, weekends, etc., to try and boil down to what's the true pace that the system is running. And here on the left-hand side, we see that in terms of thousands of loads moving per day. Again, red being total, working off of the left-hand side and of that graph, and green and blue being domestic and international, respectively, working off the right-hand side. Now, there's a couple of things that I want you to take away from this. One is that if you look at the domestic, we were running very consistently during the fourth quarter at about, call it 74,000 moves originated per day. That went down as it normally does as we got into January. February, we were slammed by the polar vortex. But the point that I want you to take away here is it never got back up to where it was in the fourth quarter. We seem to have topped out somewhere in the 71,000 range, which is a fairly significant difference, and actually even seeing yet a little bit more of a decline before sort of a modest uptick that occurred in July. Perhaps June is going to look to be the bottom of this particular issue, and maybe we're going to be able to claw our way back up in terms of our productivity. But we know we've heard about the shortages of domestic container capacity, and it's not about volume. It's not about demand. Demand is strong, but what's happening right now is that our capacity is being constrained, is being limited by low equipment velocity. Folks hanging on to the equipment longer, shortage of chassis will go on and on with all of that. On the international side, after the polar vortex disruption, we did have, I'll say, a very strong recovery and actually achieved a sort of a new high watermark here in May. But since then, it looks like we've just not been able to sustain it, and we've seen a fairly steep decline in the number of moves per day. So it looks like now the congestion is catching up on the international side, as we have certainly seen in the trade press with all of the metering and service suspensions and such that the industry has been experiencing. On the right-hand side of this is a lot of data in terms of, first, this column, which is the month-to-month change. So that's covering the slope of this line here across these various equipment types. The middle column here is the year-over-year change. And of course, if you see a number in red, that means that it's a deficit. If you see it in black, that means it's higher than it was a year ago. And then this right-hand column is what's going on with regard to the moves per working day. And you can see that we did see some uptick, but there were some areas of problems. And one that I want to point out here last month is that the rail domestic container fleet, about 1/3 of the total domestic container fleet, a little less, really had a very difficult month last month with a 7% decline at the same time that the private side of the domestic container fleet basically held steady. As a result of that, the year-over-year comparison here for rail domestic container was pretty painful at about 11% deficit, whereas a much, much smaller deficit on the private domestic container side. You put it all together and we're down about 6%, which is certainly not where we want it to be at this point in time, or perhaps where we expect it to be. Overall, intermodal is dropped about a little more than 3% from June to July. This heading is wrong. This should read July 2021. And about 1.4% in terms of moves per workday, leaving us just barely above prior year. If we look at the AAR numbers that come out, they don't allow us to really get much clarity in terms of the subsets of intermodal, but they do tell us what's going on a weekly basis. So now here we have presented data as of the prior week here, the week before this. And you can see very clearly in the North American numbers here, the black line being the weekly numbers, and this sort of thinner purple line is the 4-week moving average, that we've seen a steady decline. We saw a big drop here. This was the fires in British Columbia, as I recall, that caused this big drop. And since then, maybe I'll say a bit of a stabilization here over the last 6 weeks or so. If we look at the U.S. side, however, we don't really see yet that sign of stabilization. We still see, I'll say, a moderate but continued decline in weekly numbers. And as a result, we're falling behind prior year. We're about 4.5% behind, 5% behind prior year when we look at the most recent week ended August 28th. Now, here's the Canadian and Mexican numbers. And in Canada, we're seeing quite a different pattern here. I mean, we see this tremendous drop, which is the result of the lines being blocked by the British Columbia fires back in July. But since then, volume has rebounded. And we're sort of seeing I'll say, a semi-normal looking situation here. Whether or not we're going to be able to ramp up in a normal seasonal manner, as you can see happened a year ago, that's an interesting question that we're going to be watching the numbers to see. On the Mexico side, a sawtooth pattern, which is fairly typical there, a lot of variability and a lot of volatility in the Mexican numbers. It's a relatively small market, so it can move a lot in a short period of time. Let's look at this in a longer term context now. This is looking at the same data, the AAR data, but we are looking at the last 4 years, going back to 2018, which is the black line here. 2019 is the green line. 2020 is the blue line, and you can clearly see the pandemic shutdown here and then the tremendous recovery. And now here we're looking at the red line, which is where we are today. And this shows pretty clearly that we have fallen substantially below where we were in 2018. As you might recall, the latter part of 2018 was supercharged by the first round of the trade wars and folks racing to get ahead of threatened tariffs, which created a very strong peak season. If we look at the blue line, we're just over at the crossing over point for total North American activity. Now, if you look ahead, you can see that the comps are going to get much, much more difficult. And so unless we can get some more productivity out of the current system, the comparisons are going to go pretty substantially negative here in the coming weeks. And just to put a number to it, if you look at where we are now versus the peak that occurred last year, we need to grow 11% in weekly volume just in order to keep pace. And I don't think that's particularly likely given where we are operationally right now. So it is likely to me, as we go further into peak, what is normally peak season, that we're going to see some fairly substantial year-over-year deficits continuing to develop. The situation is a little bit more acute on the U.S. side. If we compare where we are now to the peak that occurred last year, it's a 14% increase. So right now, if you look, we're actually lower than we were even back in 2018 and to 2019. The message here being, this is not a demand story. This is a capacity story. Demand has been strong all through, but what we're seeing right now is capacity constraints that are inhibiting our ability to service the demand that's out there. And as a result, we're seeing backups throughout the chain. And obviously, just to state it plainly, this is not just an intermodal problem. This is a problem that encompasses all aspects of the supply chain. And intermodal is just one piece of that. Now, if we look at the Canadian side again, we're not in as rough a situation. We're about even with where we were back in 2019, still ahead of the 2020 volume. And I have no way to know whether or not the Canadian railroads are going to be able to ramp up to kind of match what happened last year. One point in their favor, I think, is that predominantly the Canadians utilize a grounded intermodal terminal operating system. And so they are perhaps more isolated from the chassis shortages that have been working to bring some of the terminal operations in the U.S. to its knees. And so maybe they have a better ability to continue to move containers even if chassis are short at the inland destination, they're simply stacking those containers, and eventually they will move in a normal fashion, but it's not constraining their ability as greatly to move the equipment on the rail. And here's where we are in Mexico. We're dropping fairly steeply in the face of what was a recovery last year at this time. I have no clue as to where these numbers are going to go here during the balance of the year. A lot of what happens in intermodal is a function of what's happening in terms of the imports. In fact, if you include transloads, roughly 65% of what happens intermodally is due to import-export traffic. So here we have somewhat of a similar situation. The volume is piling up outside in the form of ships waiting to anchor. The ports are running just as fast as they can, but they're not able to fully accommodate the volume that's arriving. And you can see that here, that we're kind of, it varies a little bit. I think if we put these numbers, which are the monthly numbers being handled, blue being imports, yellow being exports, both of those working off of the right-hand side here, red being total activity working off the left-hand side. Let's focus for a moment on the import picture, and we're just kind of topped out here. Even though ships are piling up, there's no ability to move any faster. If we did this on a working day basis, I suspect it would be even smoother. And we're running just as fast as we can. We're paddling as fast as we can, no matter what arrives. On the export side, we saw quite a substantial decline here in June, which is the most recent month for which we have data. And so we never really saw the same kind of resurgence that we did on the import side of the equation. And now we're back down to just about where we were a year ago. So just continuing to sort of slog along there without any real signs of tremendous progress. And you can see that here on the right-hand side, this graph, which is showing the year-over-year changes, these astronomical increases in imports when we were running strong here back in March versus when the pandemic a year ago shut things down. But since then, we've seen a marked decline in the year-over-year gains, and I expect that trend will likely continue. On the domestic side, we've already covered a lot of this. We're seeing low capacity. We're seeing folks hang on to containers and chassis longer than they normally do, which is chewing up a lot of badly needed capacity. This is inhibiting the ability to get the containers back out west, inhibiting transload activity. And it seems to be more acute on the rail-owned side right now than the private side. And the darker green is the private. On the left-hand side of each of these groups is the total, and then the lighter green, which is the right-hand column, is the rail. And you can see the pattern, and we've been slowly drifting down since March as the system just has not really been able to process the amount of volume that lies before it. We look at the share of the private container share of total domestic container activity. We had been running somewhat normal. We saw a huge jump in this past month because of the decline that we saw in rail domestic container. I don't think this will probably be sustained, but it is quite notable. So we talk about the service side. One of the statistics that is publicly available is the railroads reporting to the STB on their average intermodal train speeds. And, the story here is not great, but it is looking a little bit better because we seem to have bottomed out here at about week 26, just about mid-year. If we look at the red line here, this is the current network average intermodal train speed, which has been slowly climbing since then, but still remains relatively low versus this blue line, which is the average over the last 5 years, and the purple line, which is where we were a year ago. But certainly, this is not showing a terrifically dire situation, and that really points to the problem with this particular statistic, which is that it doesn't say anything about what's happening in the terminal, and that's where the problems are. It doesn't say anything about loads being rolled from one train to the next, or missing the train, or sitting in a stack at the terminal waiting for a chassis. Now, there are some other statistics that give us just a bit of a clue on some of all of that, and these are also reported by the railroads to the STB. And one is how many loaded intermodal cars have not moved for a period of 48 hours or more. And here you can see the red line that this number is substantially elevated over the average over the last 5 years and any of the preceding years. And the other statistic here on the right-hand chart is the number of intermodal trains that are being held for a variety of reasons, the primary ones of which are either lack of crews or lack of power. And then there's another category which is just simply titled Other, which could be congestion issues or flooding or derailment or anything else. And here again, you can see that this number is substantially elevated to the tune of basically over twice as many trains holding at any moment on average than is typical. So these are some items that are giving us a clue as to the difficulties that are being encountered in the terminal network. Of course, a lot of this ends up washing down into the drayage sector. And the drayage situation, as measured by the proprietary drayage demand index that we produce in conjunction with our good friend Jason Hilsenbeck at drayage.com, is just in unprecedented nosebleed meltdown territory. And the way to read this chart is that at least by the old standards, a level of 100 was considered normal and a level of 200 was considered to be tight. And now here we are in over 500. The ray of sunshine, the ray of light perhaps, is that at least it seems to be recently declining. But these numbers are so high, and what we're measuring here is the number of clicks in 21 individual markets that are looking for drayage capacity. It's so off the charts that it's really very hard to sort of interpret. I'm not sure that 500 is any much worse than 400. It's just that it's just incredibly high, this number, compared to any previous experience until we came out of the pandemic, during this pandemic recovery. This is a combination both of demand as well as reduced productivity with lines in all of the terminals, lines in the ports, as well as folks leaving the drayage sector, drivers leaving the sector because they're not able to get enough turns to earn a living. And there are, certainly with truck capacity being as tight as it is, there are many, many other alternative driving opportunities for them that are perhaps more rewarding. So this is a very, very severe situation and one that's going to take quite some time to work through. So just a few thoughts in terms of why this is all happening, what was different this time around, and where things might be going, and then we'll tie it up and open it up for questions and hopefully have a fair amount of time left for questions. But I think what's different this time is that when the pandemic hit, then it was such an unprecedented event, and we had no concept, neither I nor anybody in the intermodal sector had any concept of how long this shutdown was going to happen and where things were going. We've never prior to this put the economy into a medically induced coma. So everybody battened down the hatches, and I think that's true across the board. Laid off people got ready for a long, hard slog. And so when things came back so quickly and so strongly, really everybody was caught flat-footed. And that is not an indictment, that's just a statement. I don't think there was any way for anyone to foresee the shape of the recovery that occurred. The problem with intermodal, as with ocean, port terminals, or most of the network transportation functions, is that once you get behind, then it becomes more and more difficult to recover. Because as you get behind, the congestion that occurs reduces your productivity, reduces your capacity. So even as volume was coming up, the effective capacity of the industry was declining. And so what that means is you need even more resources in the terms of manpower and equipment and facilities and acreage just to stay even with what you were doing before, much less actually make ground against the higher demand. And so when that happens, and history says this, it happens all the time, we get behind. Typically, we talk about recovery. Well, recovery doesn't actually happen until the system gets a break, until volume, which it always does, normally speaking, falls seasonally and everybody gets a little bit of breathing room, and then we can catch up. And the problem here is that once things came back, in the middle of 2020. Until now, there has not been a break. So the industry has not really had a chance to recover. And as it continues to get more and more congested, then we're seeing actually a further decline in our capacity. And what's also happening right now is, as one might expect, with shippers being confronted with extended lead times and extended transit times, well, they're ordering earlier. So that means more volume is coming into the system now than it normally would be seasonally if they had some confidence that the volume was going to get there before holiday season. They don't have that confidence. So in fact, at least some of the volume that we're seeing right now is being borrowed from what would normally be coming later. That is a significant issue that I want to return to. But in terms of where we are right now, that just means operationally speaking, we just can't get a break. Now, of course, we have additional impacts in the form of weather. The hurricane in LA is going to suck not so much intermodally. There was some disruption intermodally, but it's going to suck more truck capacity out of the system because FEMA will have requirements that are going to be fairly significant, I think, which is not going to help things. And then we're going to see, obviously, I think, a lot of disruption coming from the Northeast here over the next few days and maybe even a week or so until things can get back to normal. We just don't know yet. They're still finding out where things are at. You put all this together, in terms of market share, we've really taken a hit, I think, in market share so far in 2021 because we've been capped by capacity, whereas the truck volume has been increasing, not quickly, but steadily. And as a result of that, we really took a hit on the domestic side, particularly in terms of market share. These numbers, I think, I'll call them preliminary because we continue to revise our view of the truck market, which is a derived number that I work with my good friend Noel Perry of Transport Fundamentals to create. And that's based on a lot of economic data that tends to lag quite significantly. So these numbers are still subject to revision. In fact, we've already gone through one revision on this, which pulled the market share numbers down because our view of truck in Q1 turned out to be much below where the current thinking is. But we're down somewhere in the 6.5% range or so, which if you look at this chart, we've retreated all the way back to somewhere in the 2012 range, if that holds. Not such an extreme situation on the IPI side, because international has been so strong and imports have been so strong. We're seeing that is currently still on the upswing if we look at the 4-quarter moving average. So in the near term, what's going to happen for the balance of this year. And what I think is going to happen is that we're going to start to see, as I discussed earlier, fairly substantial negative comparisons with prior year, unless we can actually get the act together and start to ramp up in terms of our capacity and our throughput. When we look at 2021, I don't think we're going to see a 2021 peak. We're going to see a plateau. We're going to see something that looks kind of like where we are now. Maybe it's more of a mesa because it might be a little bit higher than where we are now. But I don't think we're going to see a peak because the industry is not really capable of producing a peak versus where current volume is lying. Having said that, we will eventually start to see a recovery, and that I'm saying I think it will begin to occur in a recovery in operations in Q1 2022 when this volume surge that we're currently in my view, the tail end of will begin to abate. All through this, the rate environment is going to be very, very strong because the truck rates are very strong, and that really sets the pace for what happens with Intermodal. Now, if we look to next year, things are, and this is always very hard to sort of peg an inflection point. It's one of the hardest things that a forecaster needs to do because not only do you have to say, here's what's going to happen, but it's very, very important to try and say, here's when it's going to happen. And even minor changes in when things happen results in huge, huge differences in terms of the year-over-year changes. But this is my view, take it for what it's worth. I think we're on the cusp of a pretty significant change. A surge that we've been operating under now for over 12 months will end. And I think it's going to end sometime either towards the end of this year or going into next year. We are not, the laws of economics have not changed. We've seen some very strong economic growth numbers here as we've come out of the pandemic. But now, and a lot depends on what happens with regard to the Delta variant, but we're seeing things come back on the service side. So far, there's so much money available to consumers that there hasn't been a significant trade-off between services and goods. We've been able to accommodate an increase in service activity without really seeing a pullback on goods purchases. But over time, I think that will change. We're not going to see, I don't think, a repeat of the lockdowns and economic impacts, government-imposed economic impacts that we saw the first time around. So I think that what we are going to see is a sort of, at best, a flattening, and perhaps even a little bit of a decline in terms of demand for freight services, which is not really something that would normally be considered tragic. But when we're looking at coming off of such a strong environment, it's going to feel not so great. When we get that fluidity back, that network fluidity, a substantial amount of capacity is going to be created out of thin air as volume, as equipment, everything starts to move in a more normal fashion. In addition to this sort of intrinsic volume creation from smoother operations, we are going to see additional volume capacity coming in the form of new boxes, not all of which are going to make it here from China on the domestic boxes I'm talking about now. They're not all going to make it here in time for peak. And some of those are going to, we know there's a substantial percentage of domestic container capacity coming in somewhere in the double-digit range over the 12-month period. And that may be hitting, I think, at a fairly inopportune time because of this early, these other items that I've referenced. Trucking capacity, I think, also is going to considerably loosen up starting in the first quarter of next year. So what this all means is that things are going to go back to something more resembling normal. And I know I'm out on a limb on this, but you got to take your best shot at it. We'll see 6 or 8 months from now whether or not it comes to pass. My expectation is that things are going to feel very, very different a year from now than they do now. And we'll be talking about rate pressures and excess capacity versus struggling to keep up with demand. One last slide on sort of longer term considerations that go beyond, let's say, the next few months or the next year. And this is more of a sort of a structural discussion. And this is true of all supply chain suppliers, all the carriers, and even the customers. We don't really have a lot of excess capacity out there right now. No surge capacity, because everybody wants to be efficient and everybody wants to be right-sized. And so that has really reduced the resiliency of the system. And we're seeing right now that it's increased the fragility. So this is a substantial issue that will defy, I think, easy solution. But in effect, I think all of the participants are going to be needing to take sort of a very hard look at just how much resiliency that they need to build into their system. And the reason I say that is because while one couldn't forecast a pandemic or a hurricane or a trade war or et cetera, all of those are sort of individual, unforecastable, or what you might call a black swan event. But the fact is, with climate change and with all of the geopolitical tensions out there and all of the political tensions that we have here in the United States, there's always something that's happening, something that's significant. So we don't know exactly what the problem will be, but we can be fairly confident that next year there's going to be another problem of significance that we're going to have to deal with. We need to sort of design for that. Just like in New York right now, we're talking about a 100-year flood, but the 100-year floods seem to be happening over every 5 or 10 years. So the old thinking doesn't really seem to apply anymore. We've got to adopt a new lens for all of this. And part of that is just in time. We'll now need to have at least a substantial portion of just in case in terms of inventory levels, capacity, et cetera. With all of the difficulties that we're seeing right now in getting product in from overseas, and in particular in China, some of the, I'll say, softer costs of outsourcing, what used to be a no-brainer, are coming into sharper focus. And so as a result of that, I think the days of offshoring, where we were flowing jobs overseas and flowing volume overseas, are basically coming to an end, which doesn't mean necessarily that all this is coming back to the United States or come back to North America, but it does mean that probably the days where import growth rates were a multiple of GDP growth rates are probably done. So we will see something that much after this current crazy situation ends, we'll see something that looks much more moderate. And we talked a little bit before, you've heard me say this before, in terms of the great dispersal. I think freight flows are going to become more dispersed, service requirements are going to be stronger. And so we're going to have a lot of change that's going to need to occur because our environment that we've become accustomed to is changing rapidly. So with that, Hal, I'll tie it up. I'll give my shameless plug here at the end for my report, Intermodal in Depth. If you enjoy or would value this kind of analysis on an ongoing basis, we'd love to have you as a subscriber, and you can get in for a relatively moderate amount at intermodalindepth.com. So with that, thanks for your attention, and Hal, back to you.
Thanks, Larry. A whole lot of information to process there. Really appreciate it. We do have a number of questions, Larry. The first one is just a quick question about your abbreviation key. What does REV mean, and what does 000 mean on your charting?
Well, the 000 means 1,000, because that we're measuring in thousands. Right. What was the first one, Hal?
REV. Revenue
moves. So right. In other words, a revenue move is a move for which the railroad receives revenue for moving the box. So everything is a revenue move unless you're moving a rail domestic container, empty.
Yeah. The next one is, in this, I'll ask the question, let you answer it, and then I think there's a sort of philosophical question that we can talk about a little bit too. But the question is, are the data seasonally adjusted for month-over-month comparisons? And do you think that such comparisons make sense over the last 18 months?
Well, number one is I do have seasonally adjusted numbers, but though the ones that I presented today were not. Those are the raw numbers as IANA produces them. Revenue moves per day is sort of halfway between because it's not seasonally adjusted, but it tells us what's going on. And there are some fairly significant differences, both month to month and then also year to year in terms of how many working days you have in a month, that can have pretty dramatic effects on the comparison. There's a value to looking at seasonally adjusted numbers, even in crazy times like this. But the recovery and all of what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes have completely overwhelmed seasonally adjusted numbers. When you're capacity limited, then by definition, there is no seasonal change. You're just running as fast as you can. So I see sort of limited utility to trying to compare what's happening right now with what would normally be happening seasonally. There's just so many different cross currents that are buffeting things. The focus has to be right now on just what's happening operationally and how can we get that throughput up. That's my philosophy, I guess.
Yeah, to use a sort of a bastardized baseball analogy here, Larry, I think it feels like we're living through the steroid era, where we're going to have to just put asterisks on a lot of these years. Because I mean, when was the last normal year? 2017?
Yeah, I mean, you say 2018 was the year of trade war, and 2019 was the year of PSR, and 2020 was the year of pandemic, and 2021 is the year of recovery. Yeah. So yeah, no normal year.
Right. So I think we're all going to have to get together. I know there's a couple of economists on here. Maybe we all need to get together and do a little roundtable and figure out how we account for the crazy times that we've been living through. There are a lot of questions around the chassis provisioning model, how it affects the system's ability to deliver freight. Do you think that the current situation will prompt rail carriers to view chassis in a different light, i.e., perhaps as a strategic asset?
Well, that's a great question. I don't. If by that the question means, do I think that the rail carriers are going to get into the marine chassis owning business, then the answer is no. The chassis, it's a perpetual issue. What I would say is that this certainly reinforces the viewpoint that the chassis can no longer, if it ever was, be viewed as an afterthought. That it is a critical component of the chain. And one of the things that the rail industry can do to sort of insulate itself some and provide some lubrication to the system is to go more towards the grounded inland terminal model. Because one reason why the situation has been so acute is that the available chassis supply, which is stretched, is being devoted first to servicing the train. Because we need to have a chassis, if you're in a wheeled terminal, to accept the container off of the train, because one of the ways that the intermodal contractor is being measured is how quickly do you turn the train? We need the equipment back on the West Coast, let's say, for example. And so you have a situation where chassis supply is being consumed in the functioning of the internal functioning of the terminal. Whereas if you have a grounded terminal, like they do more so in Canada than here, then you just simply stack the container and then they will move out of the gate as chassis supply becomes available. So you've got sort of a buffer inventory, and you will not get the problem washing upstream like we've seen here in the States, the terminals inland being so crowded and so full that we can no longer accept inbound volume, and therefore it has to be choked off on the West Coast.
That makes loads of sense. And I do think that we do have a system fueled problem where our customers are not there. There's nothing that's disincentivizing them from sitting on the equipment, using it as excess storage, as you pointed out earlier, because they're pulling freight forward, or they just don't have even if it isn't pulled forward, they just simply don't have the warehouse capacity to unload those pieces of equipment. So they're just hanging on to it. And, from some people's perspective, if somebody's paying for it, it's being utilized, therefore it's a utilized piece of equipment. It doesn't take into effect that the network counts on that equipment to be cycling, not parked.
As I said before, Hal, there's more than enough blame to go around, or responsibility to go around. A lot of times you see a situation where individual actions make sense individually, but collectively it's a problem. And you have folks, certainly with detention and charges and such, there's a cost to hanging on to equipment, but on the part of a shipper. So on the other hand, the shipper has really no idea when the volume, when the freight's actually going to arrive. And it's arriving in bunches oftentimes and exceeds their ability to deal with it. And of course, they have their pandemic issues, manpower issues, et cetera, just like we all do. So, I don't think it's correct to say it's all the shipper's fault. They're contributing to the problem. The carriers are contributing to the problem. The ocean carriers are contributing to the problem because they have more ability to flex up and down than almost anybody. And if you just throw extra loaders on there and then, it arrives in the port and, okay, we've done our job, take care of the inland portion. Well, they have exceeded the ability of the inland network to accept the volume that they're throwing at it. So we're seeing a lot of different parts, all of which are behaving logically according to their individual criteria, but collectively it's a big problem.
Yeah, as Dr. Fred would say, there's a lot of comorbidities going on here. Here's a couple of good points. Actually, like three folks have pointed out. Please reiterate to distinguish between 53-foot domestic containers and 20/40 or slider ISO ocean containers.
They're different across a variety of dimensions. Right now there's a container shortage on domestic 53-foot containers, which is a combination of slower velocity as well as high demand. There's also a shortage of 20, 40, 45-foot container capacity, but that shortage is in China and Asia because so much volume is being caught up here in this sort of maelstrom of service issues and floating offshore in 44 ships at the moment off the coast of LA and Long Beach. So that equipment is not being able to turn and go back. And we talk about all of these sort of interconnected issues. One of the reasons that domestic containers are short is because ocean carriers really would prefer now to not take that container inland, that very valuable 40-foot container, instead just unload it in LA, let's say, and slingshot it back empty to China, where they can get another import load at an astronomical rate right now. Well, if you're going to terminate it, then you need a domestic container or a domestic 53-foot trailer to transload into, and there are no domestic containers, excess domestic containers. So this is just another example of how all of these complexities are interacting to create basically a lot of heartburn.
It definitely seems to be, there's certainly no simple solution, and there's unfortunately a lot of it's going to take time to be able to move some of these blockages through. Yeah. Here's an interesting question around Mexico. And what will the Mexican market look like after things start to get back to normal? Can we say that there will be more opportunity? Do you see Mexico experiencing the high volume, low capacity for equipment currently?
Well, the Mexico, intra-Mexico's market is very predominantly IPI, is very predominantly international. The domestic intermodal market within Mexico, 53-foot domestic container, is very, very small. It's in its infancy. Now, anytime you talk about a small market, even, it has an ability to grow really fast if they put the proper formula together. So I think there's substantial upside there. And, if we look at, and I'm trying to do this from memory, if we look at the overall domestic Mexico market, it's maybe 3% of North America. It's small. On the cross-border market, the reverse is true. That's entirely a domestic container market. 53-foot domestic containers, no trailers, no ISO containers crossing. Now, if you look at that market in terms of sort of comparing it to its peers, it's an underperformer. It has not grown as fast as a lot of other domestic intermodal markets. And we could talk about why that has occurred. Probably one reason is that it typically involves more than one railroad, and the intermodal market does not perform as well in markets that involve an interchange. That's, I think, a pretty good rule of thumb. So, regardless of where this whole situation with KCS eventually lands, if it does end up with a one railroad solution crossing the border, I think that will help grow that market, regardless of which railroad it is.
Yeah, you had mentioned potentially some of the sort of process-related differences between Canada's model and the rest of North America's model is most of the chassis are owned by the truckers, right, in Canada. Do you see that perhaps bleeding over and that trend continuing to grow in the rest of North America in terms of how that might be a reaction to this sort of unprecedented challenge of equipment over time?
Well, I do expect trucker-owned wheels, as they call it, to be a growing trend. And from an intermodal perspective, the major question or the major determinant is when the railroads, at least inland, when the railroads go to a grounded terminal operation. Because right now, if a trucker comes into a wheeled terminal, it's problematic and purely extra cost to get that container flipped off of a pool chassis and onto a private chassis. And so there are some structural impediments right now that are working against that. And I've heard multiple stories of truckers going into terminals right now where there are substantial quantities of grounded containers that are not moving, and they come in with their own chassis and cannot get the container flipped onto their chassis because manpower and and lift devices are all being devoted to working the trains, and they don't have really a dedicated resource available. So once those sort of things start to become commonplace, then I think the decision of a drayage carrier to own their own chassis or lease it on a long-term basis, I mean, that becomes a much more normal situation as opposed to this sort of convoluted situation where right now you've got an ocean carrier that's headquartered across the ocean telling you what kind of chassis you need to be, what brand of chassis you need to be using.
Yeah, that's definitely a limiter. And if you've got shippers sitting on equipment, it doesn't really matter what color it is or who owns it. But if they're going to pay the dwell per diem on that piece of equipment, it kind of makes it a moot point of who actually owns it if you can't use the darn thing.
I mean, I think in general, a trucker is going to have a more micro approach and is going to be able to have a quality discussion with that shipper to get that chassis back out of there, perhaps a little bit better than one of these large entities.
Yeah. Well, listen, folks, we got a ton of more questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to too many more of them. Folks, that unfortunately we didn't get to your questions. I'm sorry, but hopefully.
If folks have a question, they want to shoot me a question. My email is lgross@intermodalinDepth.com. They can feel free to shoot a question to me, and we'll do our best to help answer it.
Terrific. Thanks, Larry. So as I said before, if you are interested in getting some of the actual source data yourself, reach out to us. You can either visit intermodal.org and go to data statistics, or just email us at info@intermodal.org, and we'll get you information on that. For more information about upcoming webinars, head over to intermodal.org and check out what we've got coming as part of the Intermodal Adapts program that will run throughout the rest of this year. A couple other pieces that I just want to touch on. Intermodal Expo 2021 is coming up. We are going to be in Long Beach, September 12th through the 14th. So head on over to intermodalexpo.com if you're interested in finding out more about what we've got planned, how to register, booking a hotel, etc. With that, I'm going to say, Larry, thank you for all the work you did today. We really appreciate it. Thanks for the info. Everyone else, thanks for joining us, spending time with us. We really appreciate it. All the great questions and your support. And with that, I will say thank you for joining us today. We really love to have you here at IANA, where we like to consider ourselves the connecting force behind intermodal freight.